Life in the medieval ages was weird, to put it mildly, but I do wonder what the people who were living back then would think of our lives and all the weird things that we do today. Welcome back, my little bumblebees. I am your host, Amanda. Hi, I'm new here, and it's time for us to dive into the sweet nectar of the past to discuss the top 10 unusual medieval events we still can't explain. Share your medieval lifestyle facts with me in the comments. Would you ever want to live in the medieval ages? I want to know. Let me know down below. Number 10. Medieval aliens? With a lot of the tales from medieval times, it is hard to separate sometimes truth from myth. Many of these stories are actually hard to back up that we have from those days, even when they are true. I mean, they happened so long ago, it's not always easy to find substantial evidence which has survived to the modern age. And then there is the fact that a lot of things that happen in the medieval ages sound kind of ridiculous by today's standards. But this one is really something else. Apparently, there were two children who were found by a village who had green skin and spoke a language that was unrecognized by those that found them. The boy sadly did not survive, but the girl did. And when she grew up, she explained that she and her brother had come from a place that was very green and had gotten lost while tending their father's cattle, coming to Woolpit, the village where they were, via a cave. Her skin with time actually lost its green hue apparently, but it's never been determined where these children actually came from geographically, or if they even really existed, if this story is actually true or it's meant to be a folktale. Either way, it's a very strange story, even if we consider it a folktale. Like, what's that supposed to be about? Why was their skin green? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 9. Swimming test. I mean, witch trials in general were just a weird time, and one of the trials that was considered the weirdest by far in terms of tests, that is, not like actual trials themselves, cases, would have had to be the swimming test. Oftentimes those being tested were bound first and then basically dunked or tossed into the water after, of course, having been stripped down to their skivvies. Of course, being that they were bound and adding in the fact that swimming wasn't, commonly something you would have learned back then unless you were someone who lived or worked on a ship, there were accidental deaths that happened in regards to this test. The other super ridiculous part is we didn't really fully understand just yet how buoyant humans were, because we didn't know that human bodies were actually mainly made up of water. So they actually believed that if you floated, you were a witch, and it was a sign of the water basically rejecting you because you were never truly baptized, having rejected the sacrament of baptism because, you're a witch, so you serve Satan. I have to imagine that unless you were flailing aimlessly and drowning spectacularly, that most of those who were dunked were believed to be witches, and then even if you were drowning spectacularly, you might have not made it. Although, to be clear, they didn't usually tie a rope to people so they could pull them back up if that happened. However, I'm sure that didn't always work. This whole thing was pretty ridiculous though, because human bodies are naturally buoyant and don't really sink. It's not witchcraft, that's just science, baby. Number 8. Clown shoes. For some reason, people were really into long shoes back in the day. Really long toes. The longer your shoes were, apparently the more refined you were considered to be. Look at these very long-toed shoes. I can't even walk in these. So hence why people tried to get the longest shoes around to wear. Apparently the shoes were so long at one point that they actually had to be reinforced with whalebone. I don't know about you, but I've worn long pointed-toed shoes before, once or twice, and just even having a toe that is honestly like an inch or two longer than, what I would normally be wearing makes it horrifyingly hard to walk around in. I was scuffing my toes left, right, and center. But I guess if you were really wealthy back in the day, you ideally wouldn't have to walk at all. So would this be a problem? I don't know. I would hopefully have someone carrying me around, I guess, or put me on a carriage or something. Number 7. Prayer test. I personally think I would fail this test really hard, even being a good public speaker and even someone that reads avidly. Basically, the prayer test was used to figure out if you were a witch by checking to see if you could read the Bible. This was also usually something that was done publicly, so if you were nervous, scared, or worried about your trial, or just if you struggled to read, like so many did back then and some still do today, you were in trouble. The idea was that witches would not be able to read the holy words because they were witches, so they'd be like, I can't read that, God is taking away my power. That's why this existed. While like many trials it was used as proof of someone being a witch, on the other hand, if you passed this test with flying colors, it also didn't mean that you were innocent, so you're not off the hook yet. So yeah, I guess classic witch trials, am I right? Classic tests. Oh, you passed with flying colors? Well, you could still be a witch. We don't know about that. We gotta do more tests. Do the pricking test. Let's do this test. Dunk them in the water. Number 6, the dancing plague. To this day, people still don't know what caused the dancing plague to happen, which is pretty scary and strange. We only know that it did happen in 1518 and potentially a few other times earlier on throughout the medieval ages. What happened? Well, people started to spontaneously dance and then tragically spontaneously die. Some of them died from heart attacks, some dropped dead from exhaustion, being unable to stop dancing, but what we don't really know, even to this day, is why. There are a few leading theories though. One is food poisoning. I gotta say, this one sounds the most likely to me. Not just any kind of food poisoning are we talking about here. We are talking about a fungal type of food poisoning that actually could have resulted in people getting dosed involuntarily with a hallucinogenic. Another theory is mass hysteria, and another still, although one that I think is the most odd and honestly unlikely, is that people were basically forced to dance because of religious reasons. It sounds unlikely to me, however there are cases of this happening, so maybe it's not that unlikely. Sometimes people were apparently forced to dance non-stop as punishment for their sins. Honestly, a pretty exhausting and terrible punishment if you ask me. I mean, fun to start, we all like to dance to start, but you know, when you have to dance for a whole year or something, that would quickly become the worst thing ever, I imagine. And of course, you might not survive that punishment, because dancing, it exhausts you. Number 5, marriage. Many people have this idea of lavish weddings being a huge thing in the medieval ages, and while that was eventually the case, the fact remains that it wasn't entirely true, at least not at the start. In fact, weddings actually became this big ordeal because people became confused about who was married and who wasn't, with people actually not even needing permission back in the day to get married and simply needing to exchange like basically a little vow to be considered wed. And because that could happen just about anywhere, private or public, it became very hard for people to keep track of, which is why we had to have a whole to-do about it. And it's also why people had to witness the consummation of marriages. That was also part of people just being like, you know what, we just gotta make sure this is happening. Yikes. Number 4, animals on trial. One of the strangest things by far to have happened in the medieval ages was the persecution of animals. Among them, pigs were apparently the most likely to be put on trial, and sadly, many were actually convicted of the crimes that they were accused of. At one point, a pig was even dressed up as a human for its own execution. I feel like that's kind of fitting considering really humans were the criminals here, I'm sure, in this case, so why not make the pig look like a human if you're going to convict it of a crime, you know what I mean? Really, who are the criminals on Earth? I feel like we are probably those people. No animals were seemingly exempt in France, even dolphins were apparently put on trial, and I've heard stories of lawyers waiting for their clients, the rats, to attend court, only to be frustrated when they didn't show up to trial. Like, hey, we called those rats. We sent them a letter. What, rats can't read now all of a sudden? Oh, isn't that convenient? If rats ever been able to read, how would sending them a letter to summon them to court? It's so ridiculous. I know being a lawyer back in the day probably didn't carry with it quite the same prestige as it does now, but just imagine becoming a lawyer only to have to defend a rat on trial being accused of eating crops. Man, you'd be like, why did I become a lawyer again? I wonder how they decided which lawyer gets that case too. I don't know, probably like you're the least experienced one and they're like, sorry, you're gonna have to do the rat trial. Ugh. Number 3, courtly love. This one is shocking in kind of a nice way, so I thought I'd include it here to provide some levity and surprise you about some of the things from the medieval ages that actually sound, well, I mean, kinda nice. While more physical intimacy was of course saved for marriage, love was also believed to be something that could be shared among multiple partners. Now, in court, there was a type of love that was known as courtly love, which was all about celebrating the love of friends and those close to us in even a romantic sense. There were even rules made up for how to do courtly love properly. These are the rules of courtly love. This is how we do it. One of the rules even read, marriage is no real reason for not loving. Honestly, true. Super adorable. Acknowledging that most marriages were forged for political or monetary reasons and not for love, with courtly love you could basically hold hands, dance, and even laugh with other people outside of your marriage. It was basically the people at court being like, Yeah, we know that none of us are married to each other because we actually like each other. Of course, you still couldn't sleep with your courtly love partners. That was still forbidden and considered a sin. But even the idea of loving someone outside of marriage, even by today's standards, might seem taboo or unheard of. Especially if we're talking about people like holding hands and giggling together. Yet back then, it was actually just part of the courtly lifestyle. Which, in a weird way, is kind of progressive. Number 2. The Children's Holy Crusade. If you're thinking about the Holy Crusade and also thinking that it doesn't seem like something children should be involved in, you would be right. But here we are. This was actually a Holy Crusade that was attempted to be started by a child. Although, to be accurate, back in the medieval ages, there were many living adult lives who by today's standards would still be considered kids. However, even with that context, keeping that in mind, this is still a pretty wild and terrible story, I gotta say. There was a boy named Stephen who was apparently 12 at the time that led this crusade, or attempted to anyways. When he went to King Philip of France seeking support and claiming that he had been spoken to by Jesus Christ himself and told to go on this holy mission to the Holy Land, Philip refused to aid Stephen and instead told him, "Hey Stephen, you know what? Maybe you should go home. You're only 12, man." But despite not getting royal or adult support, Stephen did not stop. He continued on, gaining another child leader to his cause by the name of Nicholas. Apparently thousands of kids joined them both on their mission, although it's believed very few, if any, actually made it to the Holy Lands. We still don't really know what ended up happening to all the members of this crusade, the thousands of them, though it is believed many of them never made it back home to tell the tale of their adventure. So, pretty terrible. How did we just be like, yeah, go for it? I don't know. Seems like a weird thing. I guess no one was saying go for it, the kids are just doing their own thing. Number 1. Corpses on trial. If you thought putting animals on trial was ridiculous and inhumane, well, you're definitely right. Guess what? It somehow gets weirder than that. In this case, Pope Stephen VI decided one day to put the previous pope, Pope Formosus, on trial. The problem? Pope Formosus was not only already excommunicated at this point, but he was also very dead. The trial went down in history as one of the most ridiculous trials ever, and ended up with Pope Stephen finding Formosus guilty, stripping him of the clothes he was basically buried in, removing his blessing fingers, and reburying him. Only to change his mind, unbury him, and then toss him into the Thames. Needless to say, Pope Stephen's reign did not last even a full year, and by the end of it, he himself was also dead, having been mysteriously strangled after being imprisoned. I wonder why. I wonder who did that. That's about it for this wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the future.